Technical diving requires a lot of extra cylinders. And we need a way to attach these cylinders to our body so that we can don and doff them easily and that we can access the regulator reliably underwater. So this method of attachment, it's been around for a long time, and it's one that we can use at all levels, from carrying one cylinder to staging multiple cylinders with us. This style of rigging has a couple of key points. The first is that the top clip and the bottom clip are connected by a piece of line. The second is that that line is tight against the cylinder. Third thing is that the top clip sits on the crown of the cylinder, tight against the crown. And lastly, we've got variable length on this bottom clip. So the reason the top and the bottom clips are connected by a piece of line is so when we attach this to our body, the cylinder can't rotate. It's going to be in a fixed position. For example, if we want our regulator tied up against our body and we have it rigged like this, once we clip it on, that reg's going to sit right here tied up against our body. If we were to have an independent top clip, like we might on our side mount mains, then as we clip it off, the cylinder can rotate to the weight of the regulator. The reason that doesn't matter in side mount is because we're using a bungee to dictate the rotation of the cylinder. We're not typically using a bungee with this style of rigging. Secondly, we've got this top clip tight to the crown of the cylinder. And this is achieved by having a lot of tension down here and not allowing much slack in the line. The reason that we want it tight to the crown is because that's going to keep the cylinder close to our body and reduce drag. Now, it's important to remember that this needs to be tight and that we shouldn't be using this as a handle, because as soon as it gets loose, like this one is, you can see how the cylinder would hang much lower because this is really loose and this is no longer tight to the crown. So the reason that we have this fuel tubing or low pressure regulator hose that runs down the cylinder and encapsulates this paracord is so that we can access the bands that hold our regulators easier. So we can get up underneath here even if we had thick gloves and pull this band out to stuff our regulator hose back in so it's secure and streamlined and clean. We have plenty of options when it comes to hose retainers. The EDPM or rubber style, can tie a knot in some bungee cord and use that, or use these diving elastic bands. Now I prefer these EDPM style bands, and that's because they don't move up and down. So that means they're going to secure the regulator hoses the best. Bungee cord like this moves up and down. So as we deploy our hoses, the bungee is just going to pop right off the cylinder or roll up and down, and we're not going to have secure hoses, and it's going to be harder to stow those hoses later. Elastic like this, you can see that that's stretched and deformed. That wears out. The big downside to the EDPM is they rip. They rip a lot. As you slide your cylinders in the back of the truck, since this doesn't move, that's just going to get scraped and eventually you're going to break them. So just keep an eye on them, make sure that you're taking good care of them, have a few spares on hand, but this is definitely what I prefer. When we're thinking about clip size for this rigging, there is a lot of personal preference there, but we have to remember the longer and bigger the clip, the further away that cylinder is going to sit from our body. So if we use something like this, it's going to sit a lot further away than something like that. Typically, these medium-sized clips are going to be what we want to use. Even if you have thick gloves, there's methods that you can use with your thick gloves to still actuate these clips. Lastly, we want to protect our dry suit or wetsuit, our fingers, from the sharp metal that can be on these worm clamps by covering them up with a little worm clamp cover and using some tubular sheathing to capture the rest of the metal that's here. Now that we've got the logic behind the configuration sorted, let's look at how to actually make one of these kits. So here's everything that we'll need. We've got our 2 bolt snaps, about 6 feet of paracord, a little bit of cave lime, 12 inches of 5/16 fuel tubing, or in this case I'm out of fuel tubing, so I just cut up an old low pressure regulator hose, scissors, a lighter, and then our hose clamp. A couple notes on the hose clamp: it's important to have high quality stainless steel, otherwise this is going to rust and fall off, and since it attaches the cylinder to our body, it's a pretty important piece of gear. We want tubular webbing on this to protect the cylinder from the stainless steel and to protect our dry suit and wetsuit and fingers like I mentioned earlier. And then we want something to cover the worm clamp as well. So tubular webbing here, and either this, which is made to cover worm clamps, or you can get some piece of tubing that you can put on top of it. You can buy all these parts separately and put them all together. I just buy them pre-packaged usually. It saves a lot of time, and big takeaway here is don't go to the hardware store and buy the cheapest hose clamp that fits your cylinder. First thing we need to do is get the paracord inside the fuel tubing, and the easiest way to do that is to use a little bit of cave line to fish it through. Now we have that through, we have our paracord pretty much folded in half, about even, and we want to attach our top clip here. To attach the top clip, it's a very simple overhand knot with the clip inside, but we'll want to leave that knot loose and then go to our cylinder to ensure that this is sized properly so our clip is sitting in the right spot, which is going to be on the crown of the cylinder, not all the way at the top, and definitely not where the cylinder goes totally vertical. Once that's sized correctly, we'll push our tubing up, get that knot tight to the tubing, and tie a very tight knot at the bottom of the fuel tubing. So we want this knot snug against the fuel tubing, that way we don't have a bunch of wiggle room back and forth. Next up is our bottom clip. We'll take one of our tails, fold it up, and get that fold about a palm's length away from this top knot here. Once we have that distance, we'll take the clip and just pass it on through. And ensure that we have about that distance still, one palm's length. So now we're left with these two tails. What we want to do with those is tie a nice opposing knot, leaving space between this top knot and the bottom knot to accommodate the hose clamp. Start with our first knot here. Leaving it a little loose, that way I can adjust it some. Got the proper distance there. This is still about a palm's length away from that top knot, so I can set these knots before I start cutting. I obviously need to clean up these two tails. Got a lot of extra there. So what I'll do is cut and then burn and mushroom those cuts. So I'm left with these nice mushroomed ends and all of my knots. Now that we're all set, we just need to attach all the pieces. So the hose clamp goes in between the two lower knots, and we can slide that down. Once we get about halfway down, we'll go ahead and put the top on, and then we'll make sure this is really snug at the bottom. So hopefully that helps give you an idea of how to rig up a Deco or stage cylinder. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and thank you for watching.